So good afternoon. Fast and SharePoint better together. The purpose of this session is to give you an appreciation of the extras that Fast offers on top of the generic SharePoint platform or the vanilla SharePoint platform. We will touch on SharePoint as well, but predominantly looking at the features of Fast. So my name is Neil Hodgkinson. Anyone in my session previous to this one or the one before that? Good. You're going to see a little bit of duplication, but not. We've changed the graphics so it looks nicer. I'm a senior field engineer at Microsoft, and I'm a technical lead on the EMEA SharePoint team. An MCM and an instructor for Enterprise Search on MCM, Enterprise Search and Fast. You can tweet me if you want to, or email me if you've got any questions after the session. Feel free. And I'll let Shaun do his own introduction.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shaun O'Callaghan. I'm a senior SharePoint consultant with Calvis Limited. I work predominantly within the commercial real estate sector. For any of you guys that have had any exposure to the faceted search Coplex project, I've been involved with that for about 2 years now. Again, you can catch me on Twitter too, or if there are any questions, do feel free to drop me an email. Okay, objectives. Fast is new. What we're going to be doing is taking a broad look at Fast from an architectural, an administrative, and an end-user perspective. We're not going to be doing dev because it's IT Pro track. And looking at how Fast really adds value to your SharePoint search deployments, and really why you should be thinking about deploying Fast, and where Fast could fit into your SharePoint ecosystem. I believe we have some Fast people in the room. Yes, you do. Just raise your hand. Cool. Some of the things that we're not going to be covering in this session are around pricing and licensing, but if you have any questions around those points, please do feel free to contact the guys at Fast, and they will be more than happy to help out with that. Okay, agenda. I'm going to talk around the enterprise search SKUs very briefly and frame Fast and SharePoint within the context of what we're discussing. We'll move on to architecture. Neil is going to talk about scaling capacity, specifically within the context of Fast. I'm going to talk about the content processing pipeline and entity extraction, and why that's really, really cool. Neil will move on to shared service applications, and we'll look at the 2 shared service applications that we have now with Fast, whereas with out-of-the-box SharePoint Search, we have 1 SSA. We have 2 with Fast. Then I'll move on to end-user experience and some of the enhancements and some of the value adds that the SharePoint and Fast really deliver to end users. So, okay, this is what the enterprise search product space now looks like from Microsoft. For completeness, we put Search Server Express and Search Server in the bottom. Whether they're really enterprisey or not, probably not. What we're going to be talking about is these 2 in the top right corner here, Fast Search for SharePoint, and what that delivers above and beyond SharePoint Server in this session.
Sorry, live troubleshooting. Okay, so from an architecture and scalability perspective, we saw in the previous search session about how SharePoint scales and how SharePoint can really provide a lot of benefits in terms of scalability, redundancy, and significant improvements over what we had in 2007. So we're going to look at this briefly for SharePoint again, and then a little bit more about how Fast builds on top of that and builds in some additional capability and the additional server loads that Fast has as well. So we'll look at from a concept perspective first. So apologies if you've seen this already. I think it's important that people in the room who haven't seen it need to know some of the new terminology. So things have changed. We don't typically refer to indexes anymore, not in SharePoint speak. And from a query server perspective, while we have query servers, we really refer to things as index partitions and query components. So some of the terminology, if I run through this quickly, I'll just let this build and then I'll start from the bottom. So what we have is the concept of content sources, which hasn't gone away. We still have those. Both SharePoint and Fast leverage content sources. The crawling architecture and the connector architecture is significantly different. From a SharePoint perspective, we have multi-numbers of crawlers. We can host multiple crawlers on individual machines. We can host multiple machines running multiple crawlers. So the whole thing is very scalable and provides a high degree of redundancy. At the query level, from the indexing and the index partition perspective, indexing, once the indexer, the crawler and the index pipeline is finished with the content and pushes it out to the query partition, we're then looking at multiple partitions as well. So I harped on this quite a lot in the previous session, but we're going to look at it in terms of, from a partition perspective, we're breaking out a single index into a series of smaller chunks. It's still all one index. That's an important concept to remember. It's one single index, but broken into pieces. That gives us the ability to do crawling, or to do querying against smaller file sizes, and to do querying multiple times. So we can have multiple copies of the same query partition. We can have mirrors and failover mirrors of that query partition. And if you want to see that in a little bit more detail than you're going to see here, you need to go and look at the video of the previous session. Finally, from a Search Center perspective, and you'll see this in the demos, hopefully, the Search Center hasn't changed a great deal. There's a lot of new bits and pieces of functionality in there, but by and large, the look and feel of the Search Center, and also from the administrative perspective, the look and feel of the search dashboard or the search administration dashboard hasn't changed enormously. New functionality, similar look and feel. From a scalability perspective, when we scale these things out, I mentioned about multiple crawlers, multiple indexers, multiple partitions. The only thing that we don't scale out to any degree at all is the admin component. So while we provide redundancy for the admin component in terms of its database layer, and the ability to move the admin component between different servers and move it whether it's online or offline, depending on whether you're using PowerShell or in the UI, we don't have a specific admin component failover. It always requires administrative intervention. So looking at the scale out, if we think about how 2007 scaled out, or didn't, as the case may be. In 2007, we had this concept of the backend search database, part of our SSP infrastructure, the indexer component, which hosted the crawler architecture and the indexer pipeline. Going back a step, we could host everything on one box. Or we could move things out slightly. We could move the query server off to another machine. And we can go one further. We can add another query server. So we're kind of growing the infrastructure. Adding additional query servers meant we got faster response on query, and meant we had failover, because effectively the mirrors were, the queries were mirrors of each other. Problems with that was, on the query server and on the index server, a complete copy of the index. Massive disk consumption. In MSIT, we're looking at 500 to 600 gigs of disk per machine, per instance of the indexer. And also, things like the issues we have with the bottleneck. The crawl DB, or the search DB, had a single table in there that was responsible for orchestrating all of the crawls, the crawl queue. So you had 50 content sources all being crawled at the same time, potentially. Each one of the start addresses would be added to the crawl table. As the start address was traversed and the new URLs added to that crawl table, they were added one by one in a simple hierarchy of first in, first out, basically. So the scenario was, if you ended up with a slow crawl, a slow host in there, so something that responds very slowly, and that was in front of something that responds very quickly, the thing that responded very quickly as a source would be delayed by the slow host. And that was a source of endless performance issues and endless PSS support calls for SharePoint search. The indexer was a single point of failure, so a major issue there. The indexer fails over. Microsoft, we have a story that says, well, if it doesn't really matter that much if your index fails over because search is still online, hey, who cares? But bringing it back was a pain. You could bring a new one and re-provision it, but then you have to recrawl again. How do you get the index off that machine? It's dead. You've got to recrawl everything and start again. So while it was a moot point in terms of whether it affected your actual ability to search, it did affect staleness of data. It affected freshness of data in a significant way. So moving on from that, what have we done with 2010? 2010? Steve said that's a young term, didn't he? 2010. 2010, we have the concept of multiple index levels. So we can index now using multiple machines. We can host multiple processes on those machines. Each of those processes can communicate with a crawl database to have its own crawl queue. Okay? So you can have a crawl queue which is dealing purely with slow hosts, a crawl queue that's dealing with fast hosts, fast in this concept of speed, not the concept of the product. So you can completely run the architecture the way you want to run it. Very, very flexible, very scalable. Going that one step further, we call them crawlers, not indexes anymore. One other key thing with this, there's no index on that machine. So there's no longer a capacity planning requirement to have a huge, great big chunk of disk at this level to host the index that then gets copied up to the query servers. That's all gone away. There's only requirement for a very small disk amount here because the crawlers are stateless. They gather, they index, and they fire and forget the index off to the query servers and don't keep a local copy. There's no requirement to. At the query level, we have the concept of query mirroring. So I mentioned in the previous session about query partitioning and query mirroring. We can host, if you imagine a scenario where you have a single index and you break that index in half, you've now got two smaller files. Two smaller files can be hosted in memory much easier than one large one if you've got it split across two machines. Two smaller files means you can traverse the file faster. The query algorithm that can traverse that file to find the keywords is a significantly faster operation. And you can have multiple query components on a single machine. So if you've got the disk capacity, you've got the memory overhead, you've got the CPU capability, you can push multiple query components onto a single machine, hosting multiple copies of the same or different parts of the index, which means you can really push the throughput through. And this is the componentized architecture that means that Microsoft have not guaranteed, but targeted sub-millisecond query times at extremely high scale. Okay, not as good as fast apparently, but good. The concept of the database, so in the 2007 architecture, all of the search content was contained inside a single database, inside the SearchDB. We did have a white paper that came out, or a KB article that told you how to split that out into multiple files for performance reasons. With 2010, we've taken it one step further. We take the SearchDB, we break it into three. We have a dedicated crawl database, we have a dedicated property store database, and we have a dedicated administrative database, which is the one up in the top left. So it means we've got very scalable architecture. We can host these databases on dedicated SQL instances, on dedicated spindles for performance reasons. The MSIT recent performance characteristics of this database running at somewhere between 3,500 and 7,000 IOPS under heavy use. That's a significant amount of IOPS on a SQL server. So you need to be very careful how you host these things. And when we bring fast into the equation, the concept of fast is very different in terms of the way fast scales. And I'll invite people to jump in if I get this wrong. But fast operates on scalability in terms of rows and columns. So when we look at fast and how fast stores its indexes, yes, it has a database. The database is used for administrative and configuration settings only. Okay? All the fast indexes are stored on optimized files on the file system. When you take fast in terms of scale out, we scale out in multiple directions. From the concept of query and result processing, we build columns. So multiple columns means we can query faster, means we get faster results back. We've got more components doing the query capability, or offering query capability. From a volume perspective, in terms of how much content we're actually indexing and how quickly we want to index it, we build off to the right in terms of columns. So we have rows and columns for the scalability, which means as we push these things out, we can build extremely highly flexible, scalable architectures for fast, depending on which way we go. Talking about the region of speed for processing, looking at things like 30 million documents per node for storage, in terms of the amount of content that we host, 50 queries per second per node, and 35 documents per second indexing time. Now, those are the data I had back around Christmas time. It may have changed, I don't know, since then. But so in terms of scalability, it's very different from SharePoint. It's very, very, very specific to fast, and it's extremely scalable. 2 billion documents, I think, was the latest numbers we had for the size of the farm, size of the architecture. So looking at the actual pipeline and the processes then, from a very simple perspective in terms of how SharePoint does its job, and then we'll look at how fast does its job. Across on the right-hand side here, we're looking at our content sources. So in this case, SharePoint sites, we've got remote file stores. In fact, I'll just stand and look at this one because it's easier. Custom repositories and websites. So basically anything you think of today as a content source. It could be even a custom connector to a back-end archive system. SharePoint, when it talks to these things, uses its index servers. The index servers, the crawler servers host the crawler component. The crawler component uses a custom connector or a protocol handler to hit these sources, and basically it retrieves the data. Similar in the way it did in 2007, except the protocol API is actually deprecated for new connectivity. We prefer to go down the BCS connector route instead. Once the index server takes the data, it communicates to the crawl database so it knows what it's indexing, what URLs it needs to index. It can communicate with the crawl database to basically message back and say, I've crawled this one. If there's another crawl component, that one goes out the queue. Someone else might come in and pick up another one out of the queue. So the whole kind of orchestrated multi-crawler scenario. Following from that, once it's done its piece and it's done its indexing, content extraction, we propagate two ways. We push to the query server. So it's very similar to the way continuous propagation works in 2007, in that we index and basically fire and forget off to the query servers. There isn't a handshake and acknowledgement, but the data from the index server goes to local disk for a very brief period of time, propagated to query servers. Once the query server acknowledges it's received and processed that data, it disappears from the local index server. Okay, there's no need for the index on that system. And we also push data into the metadata database, which is the property store. So this is if you're doing your property queries or looking for querying for metadata content, this is where the property store exists and where the property data exists. The one database that's not actually listed there is the admin DB again. From a security perspective and a security trimming perspective, the admin DB is critical. It's where the security descriptors are held. That database gets hammered both ways. So if you're crawling, it gets hammered. If you're querying, it gets hammered. Be very careful about your admin DB. From the front-end perspective, users will issue a query into the web front end. The query gets sent to what's called the query processor, which is a component that knows through the topology service of the shared service architecture where to send the query. So it knows which query machines to send the query to. The query goes to both. It goes to the full text index and to the metadata store. So it goes to SQL and hits the property store to extract the data from there. And then finally, the results come back from the full text index, which are then merged with information from the property store to build a complete index. And this process, by and large, is very similar to what we have today in 2007. We're still doing that. Get text index, find the keywords, which results match my keyword, go to the property store, pull out the same references from the property store that match the results from the index, merge them into the query processor, and send the result back off to the front end. Okay, very similar scenario to 2007. When we bring fast into the equation, we still have the same kind of process at the front, except this time, from a fast content perspective, people search is another story, but from a fast content perspective, we push off the actual indexing piece to the fast indexing pipeline, or the fast indexing connector. That goes through the fast pipeline and is processed here. One thing that fast does have in addition to the typical SharePoint connectors, it has some additional connectors that we'll talk about, the JDBC connector, so it can do custom database, custom repository connection. And it has also something we'll talk about later, which is called a push connector, or push process, where you can actually push data into the index as opposed to waiting for the server to crawl it. So it's a bit better for freshness of information. The fast indexer, in terms of the processing pipeline, think about this as being an on-disk index, not a database. It's on-disk index, very highly optimized index on disk. And then from the perspective of an actual query, when the query comes in, this time it's handed off to the query and results server. So we saw those columns or those rows going up the screen on the previous slide. This is where this is kind of happening here. The more machines you're having at that level, the faster and more responsive your query engine is going to be. The query processing takes place, hands off to the search engine, and from the search engine perspective, it all comes back again in terms of search engine goes to index, pulls the data out the index, passes the data back to the query engine, and query engine all the way back to query processor and then end user. So it's kind of bypassed the whole SharePoint piece. It does its own thing. It's a slightly different story for people search, and we'll point a few things out of that if we get the demo running. So from an enterprise connector perspective, or connecting to different repositories, the key thing we're here to draw out is that Fast has additional protocol handler capability. Fast uses the SharePoint protocol handler capability, uses the database indexer for SharePoint again, and also anything that's accessing custom repositories using the BDC connectivity. Again, it's the SharePoint connector or the shared SharePoint connector. What Fast does have, in addition to SharePoint, though, is these final 4 items here, which means we can do push-based, and correct me if I'm wrong, docpush.exe is a component you can use to test that, where you can literally just run docpush.exe and just fire a document straight into the index and get it indexed immediately, and then look for retrieval for it. It's a good way to test, once you've deployed Fast, that it's actually working end-to-end. The JDBC base for, obviously, custom database connectivity. And then the concept of pipeline plugins that we'll talk about in a little while in terms of the things you can do with the pipeline to customize the pipeline for the whole indexing perspective. And then finally at the end, from a querying and federation perspective, we offer the same capabilities, albeit the fast federation, fast query engine is the similar scenario to SharePoint.
Cool. Okay.
I'm going to fix the VM.
Thanks.
Hopefully.
This is quite a common slide around SharePoint 2010 generally, search. The bit that's specific to fast, and what we're going to talk about for just a few moments, is the content processing pipeline. Now, the content processing pipeline allows us to do some very specific things with content in a pre-processing capacity, that is, before it actually hits the index. One of the key things with the content processing pipeline is that we can do entity extraction. Now, if we think that we're using fast to index, as Neil pointed out, potentially up to 2 billion documents, there's going to be a whole lot of information that we want to automatically extract from that information, things like company names, for instance. We may want to extract information around specific technologies that a piece of information is related to. What we can do is we can specify entities, and then when the index is actually, or before the index is generated, in fact, we can extract all of that content out using entity extraction, and then we can plug that into refiners. Now, we'll look at deep refiners around the end user enhancements. Basically, what this allows us to do is pretty much on the fly generate a dynamic taxonomy based upon search results, and then drill down into the search results very, very quickly based on the entities that we've extracted from the source information. In terms of how the fast index is generated, we have a piece of content that is accessed via the indexing connector. That then sends that to a content distributor, which says, right, okay, we need to do something with this piece of content now. We need to send it across to the item processing service. It's the item processing service that is the bulk of the content processing pipeline domain. This is pretty much where it all happens. And in terms of what does happen here, we detect the language. We support a whole range of languages now. We do some normalization on characters. We do tokenization and lemmatization. Basically, what we're saying is there we're removing some white space, and we are looking at what the relationships are between words and actually taking it in inflectional terms from words. So a word like buy related to buying, bought, etc. We then create something called FIXML, which is Fast Index XML. What this is actually doing, and we'll see here, you can see here that the FIXML output, based upon the original piece of content that was accessed, the whole point of this is that we normalize and neutralize the information before it actually goes to the indexing service and ultimately ends up within the index. I'm not going to run through all of these, but you guys can see them. Entity extraction, as I pointed out, in terms of the content processing pipeline life cycle, very, very important. Vectorizer is also another quite important point. What that allows Fast to do is actually produce a vector for a specific piece of content. We can then plug that into similar results search, so we can actually start linking pieces of content. So a user may not always know the exact piece of content that they are looking for within a search context, but they might be able to identify something that's very, very similar. That's what vectorization does. There are also some optional plugins around things like offensive content filter. I know we had some questions around how to manage offensive content within a search context before this session. Fast has a specific offering in that space. Are we good on the?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. And again, plugins available out of the box. You can enable and disable them. It's my understanding at the moment that with Fast ESP, what you guys could do was modify pretty much content at any stage of the pipeline. With Fast for SharePoint, we can actually only modify content after it's came through the pipeline and before it's added to the index itself. So from a developer customization experience, that's where one of the differences lie.
Sorry.
Right.
I'm fixing the machine.
Yeah. Going to do that.
Laurel and Hardy show. Thank you. It's working.
Cool.
Okay. So from a service administration perspective, again, one of the key things I mentioned early on was this concept of commonality. So what we've taken fast is taken this SharePoint search infrastructure, added the fast pieces to it, and tried to maintain a common, familiar experience. So the user or the administrator that's used to administering a SharePoint search environment should have very little trouble transitioning to a fast experience. So what we have inside of the product, from an administration perspective, is this common UI. That's probably not the right screen. Okay, ignore that picture. I'll show you this in a demo. It's easier. It's working now. We do have a common administrative UI. So in terms of going into the shared service application, managing the shared service application, that's all the same experience for SharePoint and for FAST. We support the automated management password generation. So all the features that we mentioned back on Monday are all available for the FAST services as well as for the SharePoint services. FAST is fully integrated with PowerShell. So all the PowerShell commandments, I'm not going to say millions, but there's a lot of them for FAST, and a lot of the things you have to do in FAST, for example, doing things like custom ranking, custom relevancy, has to be done through PowerShell. One thing that it also has is this concept of built-in health monitoring. So one of the things we mentioned on Monday was, and Chris mentioned in a session before, was health monitoring and health rules and the custom health analyzer for SharePoint. FAST builds into all that infrastructure. So everything that SharePoint can do now that's really cool to let you know what these problems in your environment, FAST is able to leverage that capability. It also builds into SCOM. So the SCOM management packs, which means we can do custom alerting, custom reporting, custom fix now scenarios, and custom bring me the knowledge article that tells me how to fix this problem that you've found. All that capability is available within SCOM. And then finally, the analytics piece. FAST offers an incredible amount of analytics. So the things that are happening in the index. So we mentioned in the previous session about the things that analytics can do in terms of managing and looking for where, for example, crawling is slowing down or content processing is slowing down due to specific content processing activities. FAST, again, exposes all of that. So if FAST is taking a long time to full text index your content, you can see this in the analytics, and you can take you can take the required steps to remediate that activity or to remediate that problem. So from a connector perspective, we mentioned already that we have this common strategy. So SharePoint and FAST initially leverage the same crawler architecture, the same connector architecture. It's all very common. We have the same indexing connectors for SharePoint. So it's this SharePoint crawler that goes and connects to SharePoint data, connects to the web data, connects to the file share, Exchange. Exchange is slightly different. Exchange and Lotus Notes, for example, in 2007. For Lotus Notes, it was a nightmare. You had to install Lotus Notes client on your indexer. Okay, there is no 64-bit Lotus Notes client, so there's nothing we can do with that in 2010. However, we've changed the architecture. So we've produced a BCS connector, which will directly index Lotus Notes databases and supports security trimming, which is really cool. Protocol handlers are still there. If you want to start writing C++ protocol handlers, that's entirely up to you. You can still deploy them, they'll still work. But we deprecated the API in that there's going to be no changes in the API, there's going to be no advancements in the API to make that any easier for you. Okay, we prefer you to go down, if you're indexing custom connectors, custom repositories, we prefer you to index through custom connectors written in managed code using the BCS architecture. And then finally, from a federation perspective, we still support the same caveat about open search compliancy. So federation SharePoint, federation FAST, your federated source still needs to be OpenSearch 1.0, 1.1 compliant to enable that to happen. Okay. So one of the other things we have in FAST is this concept of custom managed properties. So Shaun mentioned entity extraction. So one of the things we can do in terms of entity extraction is provide lists of items within a document that we want SharePoint to pull out and make managed properties out of. So one thing make FAST pull out and make managed properties of. So you notice when you're creating crawl properties or managed properties in SharePoint, the crawl property has to be something that SharePoint has discovered. Maybe it's a table, maybe it's a field in a list, or it's a piece of metadata you've attached to a document. It has to be something that's defined with that kind of tag, with that particular tag that says, here is an item. With FAST and entity extraction, you don't need to do that. It can do recognition. So if you've got a document that contains company names, for example, or sales data, you can add in these custom entities that say, if you find these terms, so in here, this is a bit of a list that's just showing lists of Microsoft products going back to, well, Access 1, okay, a long way back. So if the fact we have these lists here means we can take this data, add it as custom entities through the SharePoint, through the fast, either through PowerShell or through the fast user UI. And when SharePoint, or I keep saying SharePoint, when fast recognizes this information inside a document, it will create a crawl property out of it. So the crawl property will be populated by the data that's in these lists if it finds it in the document. So probably makes sense. We kind of take a document, find the word access in it, and that document becomes immediately tagged as having a crawl property for access, even though that data is purely a piece of text on a line in a paragraph of a Word document, for example. And we can add these things in a number of ways. We can add them through the UI, just as a case of add new entity to a set of lists that's already there, and I'll show you that in the demo. We can add it through PowerShell by taking custom XML, or we can add it through a SharePoint list by saying import this list, or connect to this list and view this list. And they all build in these entity extraction capability. A couple of other things we search. So from a search UI perspective, one of the things in terms of the web parts, the fast core results web part is different from the SharePoint core results web part, and that we offer these new capabilities at here. So if you look on the middle section of that core search results expansion of the web part properties, there's something called submit and spell check, or resubmit, and it's activities. What do we want you to do if you don't find any results? So make sure I've spelled the item right. Spell check it. Do a spell check. And if you spell check it, don't tell me, did you mean this? Actually resubmit the thing and bring me what I'm looking for. A bit more intelligent, a bit more capability that we don't get. We also get suggest spelling. So in SharePoint, you get the did you mean. This is kind of a similar scenario for the suggest spelling, but we can build in custom spelling capability inside FAST as well. Again, through the SharePoint, through the SSA architecture. And then on the right-hand side, one of the things that we show in the demo, and you see on the screenshots, which is the refiner panel here, this is a customized refiner panel. So again, because the web parts and the classes are open these days, we don't need to create our own. We can develop, inherit directly against the existing ones. This is a custom refinement panel where effectively we're offering buttons instead of hyperlinks, and we're offering the ability down the bottom end of the panel here to click on a pie chart and refine by the data that's in the pie chart. So it's just an additional step that we have with capabilities. I mean, you can do this kind of thing with SharePoint as well, the far right-hand side. But again, with FAST, it gives you the deeper refiners, the deeper capability to do that refinement and the more accurate information. So just thinking about other things in terms of how do we construct rank profiles? How do we tell FAST or even tell SharePoint how we want to index the data? How are we going to provide priorities or weightings or concepts of this term is more relevant than that term, or this value is more relevant than that value? And we do this through rank profiles. So the rank profiles is a very complex, I'm not sure what FAST uses, specifically in terms of the terminology. SharePoint uses BSM25, which is a standard for ranking. And the properties you see down the left-hand side here, by adjusting the properties of these values of these properties, you can adjust the way the indexing actually takes place in terms of, do I rank a certain item or a certain property of a document or a certain value of a document higher because it contains a certain weighting? Okay, so you're just adjusting. It's like a weights and measures scenario where you're balancing and trading off weights against one another to adjust the data, adjust the querying results that come back to reflect the type of information you're looking for. In SharePoint, this is all done through, you can change it through PowerShell. And it's the same, I believe it's the same in FAST when you want to change these things. Okay, so finally, just to pretty much cover off what we just talked about. Extensibility of fast search for SharePoint. So we're talking about this whole concept of configuration or configurable and extensible content processing. The SharePoint pipeline is tied in. You get what you get out of the box. The fast pipeline you can do your own thing with. You take the pipeline as it is, you can adjust it and add new items to the end. Fast query language, which I think is not, Shaun's going to cover that in a bit more detail later, allows us to have it's a custom query language. So in SharePoint, we can still have our SharePoint query language to query against the property store, for example. Fast has additional capabilities for that. And then custom rank models, we've just seen the anchor authority, query authority, the ability to modify those values and say if things follow a link, or if things are closer to me, if things are ranked higher than me, it's a certain type of document, rank it higher than a certain other type, that kind of thing. And then the extensions to the query object model, I think Shaun's going to cover in a bit more detail in the actual demo. And then finally, extensions to the shared web parts, which is kind of what we saw very, very briefly at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the fast administrative interface, really just to give you a flavor for how similar it is to the SharePoint one. Now that the demo's working. Okay, so we've got our SharePoint Central Admin. We go into Application Management, and inside Application Management, we have our service applications. Now, the key thing to note is in this particular build, because this build is configured to host fast, we have 3 SSAs, or 3 search service applications. One is down here is the SharePoint one. Okay, it's the original one you get when you deploy the original search architecture. What we have up here, though, is 2 more. We have our fast query SSA, and we have our fast content SSA. The fast content SSA is the one that's responsible for the content processing. So we're going to have a look at this one first. And inside here, again, if you think about the UI or the infrastructure updates that we received with SharePoint, it's a very similar infrastructure, very similar look and feel in terms of the administrative interface. It's dashboard style. So we have our crawl status, all the kind of activity that's taking place here. We can see our content sources and when they've been crawled and the history of those crawls. This is all SharePoint, nothing particularly new right now. One thing that's slightly different down here is if we were to look at a SharePoint SSA, and if you were in the previous session you'd have seen this, the things I mentioned earlier about the admin, the crawl, and the query components, because this is a fast content SSA, we don't have a query component. There's no query component to this particular SSA. In SharePoint, you get them all. You get admin, crawl, and query. In fast, in this one, you just get the 2 pieces. All we're really interested in this particular scenario is accessing the data, processing it, passing it on down the processing pipeline. So if I go back to the other one, sorry about going the long way around. The query processor, we see in here a little bit more data because we've got information in here about the query. So it's actually the query processor engine. And in here, we can do other things. So while we're looking at this particular scenario, what we'll see down here is something slightly odd to what I just told you before. So the content sources or the content, so the topology pieces that we saw for fast content crawler, we have crawlDB, administrative crawl component. Those are the fast content pieces. The fast query pieces, sounds like we should only really have the query bits. Why do we have content bits in here? And this is because the fast query SSA is actually responsible for people search as well. So you get the blanket statement when fast and SharePoint are together that fast does the content and SharePoint does the people. That's kind of a fairly commonly known situation. It's in fact the fast query SSA, which is SharePoint architecture under the covers, but hands off to the fast architecture for the query processing. Under the covers, you index your people content inside this SSA. We don't do it inside the SharePoint one. Okay. Does that make sense? Good. People nodding. I like that. So one other thing we get in terms of here, or in terms of the query processor piece, is this other link to fast search administration. So didn't appear in the last one. We get it in here. And that's where we can do these other bits and pieces. So we mentioned about property extraction. We mentioned a little bit about spell checking management earlier, about the resubmit with spell check and check when people are searching for documents and adding query terms, how we can spell check them. Excuse me. And the concept of managed properties and crawled property categories allows us to do the similar thing we did with 2007 in that we can say, find a crawl property, map a crawl property to a managed property, and then when SharePoint does a crawl, or in this case when Fast does a crawl, it will discover those crawl properties and make sure that the managed properties are populated for additional querying, for metadata querying. The other thing in here mentioned property extraction. I'm not standing on your toes demo-wise. One of the things in here that we have for property extraction is companies, locations, and person names, which is the default. Okay? So inside of what we actually have in here, we have these 3 categories. If we populate these categories, and kick me if I'm standing on your demo.
That's fine.
We've filled in some sample data in here. So when SharePoint or when this particular content source is indexed, if these values are discovered inside a document, as an entity in a document, just a piece of text in a document, they will be added to a crawl property and therefore become available for metadata indexing. So it's something very different that SharePoint doesn't have. And I think from a shared service application, the only thing I want to show you is when we look at the proxy group for this, what we see in here in the proxy group is that the actual SharePoint search service application is disabled. We're not using it at all. We're completely using the two fast ones, the fast content one being the fast content processing pipeline, the fast query one, which is listed here instead of the search service application for SharePoint, is doing the people crawling, people indexing, and the query capability for the platform. Okay, for this, in the case, any web application associated with this proxy group.
Cool. Thanks, Neil. Just aware of time.
Late.
Okay. So managing content. In terms of what we get above and beyond out of the box SharePoint search, really what we're looking at here is entity extraction that we spoke about and visual best bets that we'll take a look at in just a moment. So, okay, end user enhancements, the fun stuff. Okay, this is what you can expect a pretty much out-of-the-box, fast search center, search results page to look like. Some of you guys may have already seen this. So here what we're looking at is we have our refiners here on the left with exact counts. Those of you guys who implemented faceted search at any point over the last few years would understand the pain involved in actually getting exact counts for managed properties. We have in document preview or inline search results, the first page of Word documents will appear, as well as the first slide for PowerPoint. What we can also do is expand these within the search results, and again, we'll take a look at that in just a moment. We can sort on any managed property now with fast search, which is quite helpful. And we also have visual best bets. So anybody who's seen best bets in SharePoint 2007, textual, now we can provide imagery in there as well. Okay, so site admin, search admin control. As Neil pointed out, from a SharePoint admin perspective, i.e. those guys that are managing service applications, the admin experience managing fast search applications is the same as very similar in terms of look and feel for managing general SharePoint service applications. And that's the same also for site collection administrators. So things like managing keywords and best bets for fast and visual best bets, pretty much the same. Relevancy profiles and parameters, also very, very important. The ability to dynamically boost certain managed properties within search results so they appear higher than others. End user control, sorting, ranking, navigation. Deep refiners here again on the left, very important from a navigational context. Linguistics and term control. So again, the things that we're used to, keywords, phrases, synonyms, spell check is also an important one. And did you mean, and all of those kinds of things. So user context. This is very important within a fast context. When we talk about specific users getting different search results within 2007 and indeed with SharePoint out of the box 2010, usually it's within a security trimming context, so it's who has access to what, rather than what is relevant for this specific person within the organization. What user context allows us to do is actually set up user context profiles for specific groups of people within the organization. So here, in our example, we have an engineer searching for ERP. What matters to an engineer is really, what should I know about implementing ERP? From a sales perspective, obviously, very, very different emphasis. Deep refiners, again, with exact counts. Any custom metadata managed property we can plug into refiners, as well as plugging entity extraction into there as well to really build these dynamic taxonomies that that facilitate this drill through with search. More languages, including Klingon. Brilliant. It's just what we all need. Again, there's lots and lots of support there. All of these are well documented. Query language expressiveness. Okay. Those of you guys who are used to advanced query language with SharePoint out of the box, advanced query language with FAST is actually based on FQL. So again, at query time, we can actually boost properties using XRank. Sadly, this is not a dev session as much as I would like to go into all this. I'll get shot if I fire at Visual Studio. Suffice to say, advanced query language for FAST. Okay, demo.
This is the fun bit. You guys seen this already, SPC, I guess.
So, again, fast search center, very, very common looking. We have our tabs and the ability to set preferences in terms of language, all of that, pretty much the same. When we search for SharePoint, because we've run this search and now it's going to work fast, okay, we've got quite a lot going on. First thing, we have our facet counts, refiners. I must stop saying facets. Our refiners down here on the left with these exact counts, which is extremely useful. So, for instance, we may know that we're looking for a PowerPoint document. Very simply, we can refine those results based on just PowerPoint. Excellent. And inline preview works. So, okay, because we've got Office web applications installed on this machine, we can do document preview. What this allows us to do is we can see straight away the first slide from this presentation, and we can hit preview. When we hit preview, this immediately expands, and what we can do is cycle straight the way through inline in the search results, which is quite useful. What we can also do is what we were talking about earlier within the context of vectorization and similar results. We may not always know the exact document that we're looking for, but we may be able to identify something that's similar. Here what we can do is hit similar results and find a whole load of documents that are similar to that piece of content. An important point here is that we're not refining what's in core results. We're actually going outside again and performing another search based on that specific similarity and the vector. We have sorting. Again, it's not that meaningful because we haven't modified the XSL to actually bring out the extracted property. But again, we can do this on-the-fly sorting based upon a custom sort property, a custom entity that we've extracted. In terms of what the admin experience looks like, if we pop into site settings, Neil, am I being silly?
You need to go to site collection level.
Oh, okay, of course it is. Again, talking about the similar experience and how we set keywords and best bets. This is all very, very similar to SharePoint 2007 and the base product in 2010, in that we can add our best bets quite easily and keywords and manage those in the same way. And that's really one of the take-home points, that things are really, from an admin perspective, very, very similar. It's the end users that are really going to notice all of that added value in terms of refiners and user context and sorting and all of those kinds of things. So just go back to that search again. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on the end user UI? It will do because that's out of the box with SharePoint 2010.
Has everybody seen that PowerPoint expansion before? When everyone else does it, they get a kind of, woo, isn't it cool? We get a...
How many people have worked with FAST in the room previously? A few people. Cool.
The PowerPoint preview stuff is delivered only with FAST. It leverages the WAC infrastructure as well for the preview piece. What we're using, it's purely a FAST capability. You don't get that with SharePoint. In terms of both the preview, as in this particular document here, it's a Word document, you see in the first page, but for the PowerPoint piece, it's FAST specific. Yeah. No, it can do, from a preview perspective, you get, in this case, you've got the Word document. From the preview piece, from the scrolling PowerPoint deck, you get the PowerPoint. There is a plugin, which I tried to get for this session, which can do discovery of charts and worksheets from a Gemini perspective, looking at things like Power Pivot or Excel. It's like an Excel miner. I couldn't get it for this session, unfortunately, but that will, instead of giving you the Excel results, which just shows you a whole pile of cell data that just looks a real mess, you actually get the charts and the more visible tables and things from the actual data. It all looks a lot nicer. So if you saw Jeff Fried's SPC session, he actually demonstrated that there at the SharePoint conference.
So you just mentioned type ahead in the search box.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know any more about that? How would I manipulate what gets suggested in there? And is that a fast only thing, or?
It's with SharePoint 2010 out of the box, I believe, as well.
Yep. Yep. It's based on the previously submitted search queries that return results.
Yeah, as part of the logging.
Yeah, part of the analytics infrastructure and the login, the usage analytics infrastructure stores that information.
It's using client OM, so I guess you could write your own.
Yeah. So everyone hear the question? So the question was, how can we manipulate, or how do we discover how does the type ahead system work? Where does the information come from, and can we manipulate it? It works based on the previously issued queries through the web analytics or the usage analysis pieces of SharePoint, so it knows what queries have issued before, what queries issued results, and what queries were the top queries for that particular term that you're doing type ahead on. In terms of manipulation, you can certainly manipulate the list as an admin and remove terms from an admin perspective. So we had a chap asked us earlier about what if someone in the company gets disgruntled and throws a load of queries in there for words you wouldn't want to see in type ahead. Can you manipulate that and take them out? And yes, you can. You can remove those. Plus also, they would only show up after a certain number of users that issued those queries anyway. It's kind of it starts with the top set.
The auto classification features as it's going into the index, the entity extractions.
Yeah.
Is there a way of hooking into that so that you can actually write that back as proper metadata back on the original document?
Okay.
Is there a hook?
Okay. So the question was, if you're using custom entity extraction, can you intercept that entity extraction and write it back to the document as metadata?
Yeah.
So make something, fill in the metadata fields based on...
Fast to automatically classify your data store.
Well, me that knows absolutely nothing about development, I'm going to hand that over to Shaun.
In theory, yes, you can.
And slope shoulder the question.
The kind of problem that we have on it, the problem is that we don't have really any anecdotal evidence as to how this is being used, given that it RTM Friday. But suffice to say, given that we can access the content at the end of the pipeline before it hits the index, there's certainly no reason why not. Okay, last couple of slides.
Just the one thing, just go back to that, Shaun, a second.
Sure.
One thing Shaun didn't point out was the visual best bet. We deliberately stuck an evolutions visual best bet in there just to kind of highlight the fact you're searching for SharePoint, and we're doing the SharePoint evolution conference, so that's kind of triggered by the keyword SharePoint. Okay.
So, what we get above and beyond SharePoint, 2010, deep refinement, the browser previews of Word and PowerPoint documents, sorting on custom metadata, user context, and similar results. In terms of, from query capability perspective, it's FQL, really, that is above and beyond what we get with SharePoint 2010. Now, this was a difficult one to think about, because it's all fine and well.
We should actually invite comments from our FAST colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. We should. First of all, FAST is not cheap, not by any measure, and customers are not going to implement FAST just because they're doing SharePoint. That's just not going to happen. So why are they? And it's not going to be for visual best bets either.
Touche.
Oh, thank you. Maybe it's going to be scale. If we think that we support, or SharePoint supports some, is it 100 million out of the box? Yep. And FAST is going to support between 1 and up to 2 billion. Maybe that's going to be the reason to implement FAST. Maybe it's going to be the customization. Maybe you want to do some specific translations on content in the pipeline before it hits the index, and you're running massive multilingual billions of documents. Maybe that's going to be a reason. Maybe it's going to be to add enhancements to the end user experience around deep refinement and user contextual search and all of those kinds of things. Scale does feel like it's going to be one of the driving factors from my point of view. But I think for all but bigger customers, it's going to be almost prohibitively expensive. I would imagine. Certainly within the SME sector, I don't see this.
I'm saying nothing's a fast guy sat over
there. Yeah, it's
and I work for the same company as him.
Indeed. If we look at the kind of customers that implement fast ESP, and we take that as a measure of the kind of customers that are going to be interested, Financial Times, for instance, Factiva, big research type organisations that have public-facing sites. Again, scale and content. So
what we tried to do was think of some use cases, and this was extremely hard, and we would encourage the FAST guys in the corner to actually come out, and if you've got anything to say in terms of use cases for FAST specifically, to kind of add to these. So we thought about things like research portal, things where fast access to information, extremely fresh content is really important for people doing research. Research is expensive, or certainly expensive in certain scenarios. Call center portal, really in terms of things like making sure we can get all the data we need, making sure that we're not just indexing documents or content from a people perspective, but purely what type of information would a call center gather about problems or about mortgage applications and things like that. Different types of data that SharePoint doesn't normally deal with. And then think about things like risk management, e-discovery, and parts search. So very, very structured, very complex search scenarios that SharePoint will not really deal with specifically in its own right, unless the end users are empowered or forced almost to add a lot of custom metadata to the content that they're adding to these types of repositories. SharePoint will not do this kind of concept of entity extraction and the same relevance of same relevance and ranking capabilities that FAST has in these use cases. And then finally, from an employee self-service perspective, the whole concept of conversational search. So Shaun mentioned the concept of user context, where FAST can take information about the user based on the user profile and really tweak and tailor the results specifically to the end user. That can be really powerful from a perspective of a sales scenario or an engineering scenario. When I do a search in Microsoft and MSW, I've already started to notice that my searching information is much richer and much capable by searching internally at Microsoft on our FAST-enabled sites. there's much more relevance to my job role, to my own role within the company, is being delivered when I'm searching within Microsoft. And that is, for me, is a really big win. I don't want to see marketing slides when I'm searching for content about SharePoint. I want to see engineering data, and that's happening now. That's happening today inside Microsoft.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
So with that, we're done. Any more Q&A? Questions on licensing, costings, etc.? The FAST guys are here. Anything technical from a SharePoint or FAST perspective? There is a massive amount in the product. We only had an hour. We tried to cover as much as we could. There's a hell of a lot more that can be covered, and a hell of a lot more we're yet to discover. Feel free, if you've got any more questions, to fire them out. Question?
Hi, Bill.
Is there fast technology in SharePoint 2010 search product now?
That's a very leading question.
Now that Microsoft acquired,
Is there fast technology?
you're getting part of it in SharePoint.
Sorry, yeah. Is there fast technology in the share? I think Microsoft have learned significantly from what fast had before, especially around scalability and redundancy and the whole scale of the architecture that fast had. We've learned from that and implemented that. I wouldn't say that we've taken fast pieces, because we certainly haven't. You know, the SharePoint is SharePoint and fast is fast. If you look at when you install fast alongside SharePoint, you don't install it on top of SharePoint. You know, it sits in, it is a separate piece of technology. They're just very tightly woven together. Yes, Microsoft learned a lot. Fast still are the premier leading search, you know, fast search and transfer, the best search engine you can buy for your money, potentially. Taking my Microsoft hat back off again. But we're bound to learn. You know, think about the people we brought into Microsoft. Think about the technology we brought into Microsoft. We had to learn from that. But if you're asking specifics, I don't know. I suspect not specifically. Any other questions? Can we go home?
Oh, hang on.
Oh, thanks, Chris.
Brill. Cheers.
I was just getting...
I thought I'd delay that as much as I could. For incremental crawl, am I right to think that both architectures would still use the changelog?
For hitting SharePoint content, yes. So question was for incremental crawl, will both architectures use the changelog? Yes, because we still use the same protocol handler. We still hit the site data web service to pull out the changes and then do the crawl based on those. So we're still doing the front-end web server crawl capability, albeit it's much more flexible and changed significantly in this version. Okay,
Cool.
thanks for coming.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers. Sorry, good question.